In this lesson, we will learn how to modify an object's axis. An axis is simply the point at which an object pivots from. So we saw in the previous lesson we had an issue with our pod control, and that when we rotated, it rotated from the wrong axis. Thankfully, in Cinema 4D, we have ways to fix this. We can use its axis modification tool. When we enable this, let's take a look. Watch, when we start to move this back, you can see that the null object moves, but the children, all of those objects parented underneath this object, are unaffected. So watch, when we go ahead and now turn off the modification tool and start to rotate, you can see now we're getting a much better result. But we're still not exactly where we need to be. So let me go ahead and show you a technique I like to use to align objects, because what we need to do, let me go ahead and just undo back with Control Z. What we need to do is make sure that the pivot of our pod is at the same pivot of our wing. So what we'll do then is have an object, just a temp object, match to the axis of our wing, and then we'll go in and take our group object and align it to that very spot. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do here is just make sure that all of the objects underneath our group are separated out temporarily. Because instead of using the axis modification tool here, we're going to actually work with a position constraint to align this object. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll middle click on the group to grab all of its children, including the object, and I'll go ahead and now control click on the group so that we can go ahead and deselect it. So with all of these objects of the pod selected, let's go ahead and now create a temp group. We'll just create a group object, and we'll separate it outside of the hierarchy of our pod control. Alright, great. So now we can go in and we'll hide under the filter menu polygons as well as our hypernerve objects. Next, let's go ahead and create another null. So I'll go ahead and just make a null here. And heading over to object, let's go ahead and set its display to point. We'll set the orientation to XY, and we'll go ahead and increase its radius so it's a little bit easier to work with this object so we can see it. Alright, so we need to align its position to our wing. So in order to do that, we'd first select our null, shift select where we'd like to align it to, and now we can go ahead and work with a position constraint. So that's character constraint position. So now you'll see that the null is aligned to our wing. And here's what's great about working with constraints. We can lock down control over certain axes. So you can see if we were to go to our move tool with our wing control selected and move that around, the null will follow. However, if we try to rotate, it will not, because we've only locked this object down in its position. We'll learn more about constraints when we start to rig the landing gear, so that's going to be a really fun lesson. But for right now, once the null is in place, you can see it has a constraint tag locking down its position, but we no longer need that tag, so we can just go in and delete that. Alright, great. As long as we don't move the null, we're good to go. Let's go ahead and now grab our group object, and let's go ahead and align it to our null. So it's the same process. With the group selected, we'll shift select our null so that we can align the group to the null, and we'll go ahead and apply a position constraint. So once the group is in place, you can see it has its constraint tag here, which we do not want. So let's go ahead and now delete it so we are free to animate the movement of this control now. We also no longer need our null because the group is aligned. And what we could do is now start to take those objects under our temp group and go ahead and add them back to our pod group. So again, we'll middle click on our temp null. Let's deselect the null, control clicking it. And now we'll go ahead and drag all of those objects back into our anim pod group. Beautiful. I'll go ahead and collapse this group so we can go to our temp group here, the null, and just go ahead and delete it. We no longer need that object. And here's what we're left with. If we go back to the filter menu, polygons, and also show our HyperNerve objects, you can see when we grab the pod and starts to rotate, now it's rotating from the right spot, which is very exciting. So we've learned how to modify an object's axis in this lesson, and we're not quite done yet because our fan blades, let's take a look. If we were to go ahead and grab, let's say the ones on the left side of the plane, our right, if we were to go ahead and grab that and start to rotate in our heading axis, I'll also go ahead and make sure that we have all axes enabled. I'll go ahead and rotate from that axis, and what you'll see is that we have this wobbly behavior because the axis is slightly off. And just to make sure we are rotating properly, I'll turn off world mode at the top. The hotkey for that is the W key, and now we're in local mode, and you can see again we have an issue with the pivot of this fan. So let's go ahead and adjust that. With both fans selected, we can now move to our side view. Just middle click. Once we're here, we'll go ahead and zoom in, and we'll make sure that we are using our axis modification tool, so we're just affecting its axis. Now we can start to adjust our pivot so that we now have the proper rotation. So I'll just go ahead and rotate this down so that it flows with the direction of our geometry. I'll go ahead and turn off the axis modification tool, and let's move back to our perspective view. We could select our fan blade. And again, as long as we're rotating in local mode, let's take a look as we start to twist this. You can see now we're getting the control we need. No longer are we getting that wobbly behavior. Very exciting. So we've learned how to, again, modify an object's axis in this lesson. Since we have modified these objects, you can see going to coordinates, we need to go ahead and clean them up a bit. So, with them both selected, we could always go ahead and freeze their transforms. Let's go ahead and check the group of the pod as well. Again, we need to freeze its transforms down. Let's go ahead and do that. Beautiful. And we are good to go. So, now that we have this taken care of, in the next lesson, we're going to start the process of setting up secondary controls using user data.